Good evening, my friends, and welcome back to Horror Whispers. Tonight we share 9 most disturbing true trucker tales from the Appalachian Mountains. If you are new here, please subscribe to my channel and hit the bell so you never miss a chilling story. Now let's begin. My name is Harvey Collins. I'm 51 years old, and for 30 of those years I've been a long-haul trucker. I've crisscrossed this country more times than I can count, seen every sunrise over the Rockies and every sunset over the plains. I've dealt with jackknifed rigs in Wyoming blizzards, outrun tornadoes in Oklahoma, and navigated the concrete jungles of Los Angeles and New York. I'm not a man given to flights of fancy. What you see is what you get. A half-empty coffee cup, a worn-out flannel shirt, and a healthy dose of skepticism for anything that can't be explained by bad weather or bad wiring. But what happened one autumn night on the Blue Ridge Parkway? That's something different. It's a story that settled deep in my bones, a chill that no amount of truck stop coffee can warm. It was late October, the time of year when the Appalachians put on their final glorious show. The mountains were a riot of color. Fiery reds, burnt oranges, and brilliant golds, all set against the deep green of the pines. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. I was on a non-essential run, hauling a light load of furniture from Roanoke down to Asheville. It was a scenic route, a welcome change from the monotonous drone of the interstate. The Blue Ridge Parkway isn't built for speed. It's a road that forces you to slow down, to wind and curve with the contours of the ancient land. As day bled into evening, a thick fog began to roll in, as it so often does in those mountains. It wasn't a gentle mist. It was a heavy, wet blanket that swallowed the world whole. My headlights, powerful as they were, could barely punch a hole 20 feet in front of my grill. The vibrant tapestry of the forest dissolved into a gallery of ghostly, skeletal shapes. The world shrank to the size of my cab, the rhythmic thump of my wipers and the low rumble of the diesel engine the only proof that anything else existed. I was navigating a particularly tight series of switchbacks, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, when I saw her. She was standing on the narrow shoulder just at the edge of my headlight beams, a lone figure in the swirling gray. It was a strange place for anyone to be, miles from the nearest town or scenic overlook. She wore a simple, old-fashioned dress, the kind you might see in a black and white photograph, and a thin shawl was draped over her shoulders. She wasn't thumbing for a ride, just standing there, looking out into the impenetrable fog as if waiting for someone. My first thought was that her car must have broken down. It was a dangerous place to be stranded. I slowed my rig to a crawl, the air brakes hissing in protest. As I pulled alongside her, I rolled down the passenger window. The cold, damp air rushed in, carrying with it the earthy smell of the forest floor. "Ma'am? You all right out here?" I called out. She turned her head slowly and my breath caught in my throat. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with a face that was both beautiful and deeply sorrowful. Her eyes, large and dark, seemed to hold a century of sadness. Her skin was pale, almost translucent in the glow of my dashboard lights. "I need to get to the bottom of the mountain," she said, her voice barely a whisper, as soft and ethereal as the fog itself. "My family is waiting." Every instinct I had screamed that something was wrong. There was no broken-down car, no sign of an accident. Just this woman, alone in the cold and the dark. But I couldn't just leave her there. My mother raised me better than that. "It's a long walk and a cold night for it," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "Climb on in. I can take you down to the next town." She gave me a small, grateful smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and walked to the passenger door. I leaned over and pushed it open for her. She climbed in with a quiet grace, settling into the seat without a sound. The cab, which had been my solitary kingdom for countless hours, suddenly felt different, occupied by a presence that was both real and profoundly unreal. "Name's Harvey," I said, putting the truck back in gear. "Eleonora," she replied, her voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it over the engine. We drove in silence for a while. I tried to make small talk, asking where she was from, what she was doing out on the parkway so late. Her answers were vague and brief. She spoke of the mountains as if she were a part of them, her words painting pictures of a time long past, of horse-drawn carts and small, self-sufficient communities nestled in the hollows. It was strange, but I chalked it up to her being from one of the more isolated parts of the region where the old ways still held on. The most peculiar thing was the cold. As soon as she got in, a deep, penetrating chill filled the cab. It was a damp, cellar-like cold that had nothing to do with the autumn night outside. I cranked the heater up to full blast, the fans roaring, but it was like trying to heat the outdoors. The cold seemed to emanate from her, a silent, invisible aura. I glanced over and saw that she was shivering, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Draped over her lap was a beautifully knitted scarf, a deep shade of crimson with an intricate pattern of white flowers. "Here," I said, shrugging off my heavy flannel jacket. "Take this. You'll freeze to death." She looked at me, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise, maybe even gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, allowing me to drape the jacket over her shoulders. She snuggled into it, and I felt a pang of fatherly concern. She looked so fragile, so out of place. We continued our slow descent down the mountain. The fog was relentless, and the silence in the cab stretched on, broken only by the rhythmic beat of the wipers. I found myself growing drowsy, the warmth of the heater finally starting to push back the unnatural cold. I shook my head, trying to stay alert. The road demanded my full attention. I must have been focused on a particularly sharp curve, my eyes glued to the white line on the edge of the pavement, because when I glanced back at the passenger seat, it was empty. My heart hammered against my ribs. I slammed on the brakes, my rig groaning to a halt in the middle of the deserted road. The cab was empty. The passenger door was closed and locked. But she was gone. It was impossible. The truck had been moving at 30 miles an hour. There was no sound, no struggle, no rush of wind from an open door. She had simply vanished. Panic set in, cold and sharp. Had I imagined it all? Was I so tired that I had hallucinated a passenger? I looked around the cab, my eyes darting, searching for any proof. And then I saw it. My flannel jacket was folded neatly on the passenger seat, and lying on top of it was her crimson scarf. The sight of it sent a jolt through me. It was real. She was real. The scarf was physical proof, a tangible object in a situation that defied all logic. I picked it up. The wool was soft and surprisingly warm, a stark contrast to the cold that had filled the cab. I sat there for a long time, the engine idling, the wipers still beating their lonely rhythm against the glass. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. There was no rational explanation. My first thought was to call the police, but what would I say? That I picked up a woman who disappeared from my moving truck? They'd think I was drunk or crazy or worse. I was a trucker with a clean record, and I wanted to keep it that way. Driven by an impulse I didn't understand, I turned the truck around. It was a difficult maneuver on the narrow road, but I had to go back. I had to find where I'd picked her up. Maybe I'd find a clue and answer anything. As I drove back up the mountain, the fog began to thin, as if the mountain itself was revealing a secret. I found the spot easily enough, and just off the road, almost completely hidden by a thicket of rhododendron, was a small wrought iron gate. It was the entrance to a cemetery. I hadn't even noticed it in the fog. It was an old, forgotten place, the headstones tilted and covered in moss. With a growing sense of dread, I grabbed a flashlight from my glove box and the crimson scarf. I pushed open the creaking gate and stepped inside. The air was still and heavy. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of weathered stones, their inscriptions faded by time and weather. I walked slowly, my boots crunching on fallen leaves, a strange feeling of being watched prickling the back of my neck. I don't know what I was looking for, but I knew I would recognize it when I saw it. I moved from stone to stone, reading the names and dates. Most were from the 19th and early 20th centuries. And then I found it. It was a simple, elegant headstone slightly apart from the others, overlooking the valley below. The name carved into the granite was clear, untouched by the years. Eleanora Vance, born 1901, died 1923. My blood ran cold. The name. It was her. According to the stone, she had been dead for nearly 100 years. My mind reeled, refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. It had to be a coincidence. It had to be. But then my flashlight beam fell on the base of the headstone. There, carved into the stone beneath her name, was a small, delicate flower, the very same pattern that was woven into the crimson scarf I held in my trembling hand. I stood there, frozen, the pieces of the impossible puzzle clicking into place. The old-fashioned dress, the deep, abiding sadness in her eyes, the story of her family waiting at the bottom of the mountain, a journey she had been trying to complete for a century. With a hand that shook uncontrollably, I reached out and draped her scarf over the top of the cold, damp gravestone. It felt like the right thing to do, like I was returning something that had been lost for a very long time. As the crimson wool touched the granite, a sudden gust of wind swept through the cemetery, rustling the leaves and moaning through the pines. For a fleeting moment, I thought I heard a soft whisper on the wind, a single grateful word. Thank you. I didn't wait for another sign. I turned and ran from that place back to the safety of my truck. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up and the haunted peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains were far behind me. I never took that route again. Some nights, when I'm alone on a dark highway, I think of her. I think of that deep, unnatural cold and the sorrow in her eyes. I'm a practical man, but I can no longer say I don't believe in ghosts. I gave one a ride, and in the quiet, humming solitude of my cab, I still have the jacket that a ghost wore, and sometimes when the air gets cold, I swear I can still smell the faint, sweet scent of a world long gone. Did you enjoy this story? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to like this video. And now, let's begin our next terrifying tale. My name is Samantha Reeves. I'm 34 and I represent a paradigm shift in the world of trucking. The old-timers with their dog-eared maps and gut feelings look at me and see a kid playing with toys. My cab doesn't look like a traditional big rig. It looks more like a mobile command center, a tech startup on 16 wheels. I've got a top-of-the-line GPS with real-time traffic, weather overlays, and vehicle tracking. I have a satellite link for my laptop, a multi-band CB and HAM radio setup, and a half-dozen other gadgets that keep me connected, informed, and efficient. For me, trucking isn't about the romance of getting lost on the open road. It's about the science of logistics, the art of precision, the beauty of a perfectly executed route. I trust my instruments. I trust data. I trust the clean, logical, digital lines on my screen more than I trust my own eyes sometimes. My eyes can be deceived by fog or fatigue. Data doesn't lie. That's why what happened in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park still messes with my head on a fundamental level. It wasn't just a spooky encounter. It was a catastrophic failure of my entire worldview. It was a night where the digital world I relied on, The world of bits and bytes and absolute logic was invaded and overthrown by something ancient, impossible, and terrifyingly real. I was hauling a refrigerated trailer, a reefer, full of fresh produce from a distribution center in Knoxville to a wholesaler in Charlotte. The route takes you right through the heart of the Smokies on I-40, a stretch of highway famous for its stunning beauty and its treacherous, unpredictable weather. It was a late-night run, my favorite kind. The four-wheelers are all tucked in their beds. The roads are empty and you can just find your gear, set the cruise control, and eat up the miles. The world shrinks to the bubble of your headlights and the steady, reassuring hum of the engine. That night, however, was different. A thick, soupy fog had descended, a signature of the Smokies. They don't call them that for nothing. This wasn't a gentle mist. It was a heavy, wet, oppressive blanket that swallowed the world whole. It was like driving through a glass of milk. My powerful LED headlights, which could normally turn night into day, could barely punch a hole 50 feet in front of my grill. The towering, majestic trees on either side of the highway were just dark, menacing smudges, ghostly shapes that loomed and then disappeared. The isolation was profound. I had my primary GPS on, a brand new Garmin with all the bells and whistles. One of its handiest features, especially for a woman driving alone at night, is the real-time vehicle tracking. It uses a combination of network data and transponder signals to show you other vehicles on the road, represented by little electronic blips on the map. It's a great way to maintain situational awareness, even when you can't see. That night, the screen was mostly empty, just my own little truck icon crawling along the winding digital representation of I-40. I was feeling a little on edge, the silence and the suffocating fog amplifying the natural loneliness of the job. I switched on my CB radio, hoping to catch some chatter from other drivers, a human voice to break the monotony. All I got was a wall of statics, as if the fog itself was smothering the radio waves. That's when I first saw them. Not on the road, but on my GPS screen. A series of new blips appeared on the map about 5 miles behind me. First one, then two, then they populated in a rapid cascade, 5, 8, 10. A whole convoy. They were moving fast, their digital icons closing the distance to mine at a steady clip. My first reaction was a wave of relief. Company, other souls out here in the soupy darkness. It made the world feel a little less empty. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see the warm, reassuring glow of their headlights cutting through the fog any second. But there was nothing. Just the impenetrable, swirling wall of white behind me. I looked back at the GPS. The blips were closer now, maybe 2 miles back. They were perfectly spaced, moving in a tight, disciplined formation that was, frankly, a little odd. Truckers, especially in conditions like this, tend to give each other plenty of room. This looked more like a military procession. I tapped the screen, zooming in on the icons. The GPS software is amazing. It can even give you basic vehicle info if it's available from the network. These were all classified as heavy goods vehicles, but that's all it said. No company name, no dot numbers, no transponder IDs. Just 10 anonymous, ghost-like blips gaining on me. A prickle of unease started at the base of my neck. I checked my mirrors again, leaning forward, straining my eyes until they ached, trying to pierce the veil of fog. Nothing. The road behind me was a void. Yet my GPS, my infallible data-driven guide, insisted that a 10-truck convoy was now less than a mile from my tailgate. My logical mind went into overdrive, searching for an explanation. A server-side glitch in the tracking software? A localized sensor anomaly caused by atmospheric conditions? Maybe a military convoy testing some kind of new stealth technology? That last one seemed ridiculous, the stuff of conspiracy theories, but it was more plausible than the alternative my gut was starting to whisper. That the GPS was right and my eyes were wrong. The blips were right on top of me now on the screen. The first one was shown as being directly behind my trailer, so close its icon was overlapping mine. My heart began to pound a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. I could feel a cold sweat beating on my forehead. My eyes darted between the empty fog-shrouded mirrors and the GPS screen, which was screaming a reality that my senses vehemently denied. It felt like I was caught between two worlds, the digital and the physical, and they were telling me two completely different stories. I had always trusted the digital. And then I heard it. It wasn't the high-pitched whine and roar of a modern diesel engine. It was a low, guttural, multi-layered rumble, a chorus of engines that sounded old. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate up from the road through my tires and into the very frame of my seat. It was a deep, resonant hum that felt ancient and immensely powerful. The air in my cab grew heavy, thick with the smell of diesel exhaust, but it was a richer, more acrid, oilier smell than I was used to. It was the smell of an old, inefficiently burning engine. Slowly, as if materializing out of the fog itself, a pair of headlights appeared behind me. They weren't the bright, white, angry LEDs of a modern truck. They were dim, yellow, perfectly circular lights, like the eyes of some great nocturnal creature. Then another pair appeared beside them, and another, until my mirrors were filled with a ghostly procession of faint, glowing orbs, all hovering in the mist. They were real. My GPS hadn't been glitching. My technology had been right all along. The first truck pulled out into the left lane to pass me. As it drew alongside my cab, I stared, my logical 21st century mind struggling to process what I was seeing. It was a truck from another era, a 1940s-era Mack or a Peterbilt maybe, with a long, rounded nose, a tall, narrow cab, and great curved fenders over the front wheels. It was covered in a patina of rust and grime, its paint faded to an indeterminate dark color. But it moved with a silent, inexorable purpose. There was no roar of an engine as it passed, no thunder of exhaust, just that pervasive, low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I looked up at the driver's window, desperate to see a face, to make some human connection, to get a wave or a nod that would make this situation feel normal. The driver was a silhouette, a dark shape behind the wheel, his form obscured by the grime on his window. But as the truck began to pull ahead, the figure turned its head as if sensing my stare. And for a split second our eyes met. There was nothing there, just a blank, vacant stare. The eyes were dark, empty sockets, devoid of life, light, or recognition. It wasn't a person driving that truck, it was an automaton, a hollow shell, a puppet being guided by some unseen hand. The sight sent a jolt of pure, primal terror through me. One by one, the other trucks in the convoy passed me. They were all the same, vintage models from the 40s and 50s, relics of a bygone age of trucking. A Diamond T, a bulldog-nosed Mack, an auto car. Each one was battered and weathered, looking as if it had been dredged from the bottom of a lake, yet they moved with an eerie, uniform grace. And in the cab of each one, the same story repeated itself. A shadowy figure behind the wheel, a brief, slow turn of the head as it passed me, and those same empty, soulless eyes. No one waved, no one flashed their lights. It was a silent, ghostly parade of the dead. I was paralyzed, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached and my knuckles were white. I was no longer a driver. I was a spectator to something that shouldn't be happening, a witness to a procession that defied all the laws of physics and time. The convoy moved ahead of me, their 10 sets of dim yellow taillights forming a perfect, unwavering line before me. A funeral procession on the fog-bound highway. The strangest part was the silence of it all. 10 massive, heavy-duty trucks, and they made almost no sound, just that pervasive, low-frequency hum that I could feel in my teeth. They didn't seem to interact with the physical world in a normal way. They didn't kick up spray from the wet road. They didn't buffet my truck with a rush of wind as they passed. They were like a projection, a memory replaying itself on the dark, wet canvas of the night. I followed them for what felt like an eternity, my mind numb with a mixture of terror and a strange, morbid awe. I glanced at my GPS. It was still tracking them, their 10 blips perfectly aligned, moving in flawless unison. Then I saw something on the screen that made my blood run cold. The map showed that the convoy was approaching a turnoff, an exit ramp that led to an old scenic route, according to the map's data. But as I looked ahead through my windshield, my eyes scanning the right side of the road, there was no exit. There was just the solid rock face of the mountain, a sheer wall of granite that had been blasted away decades ago to make room for the interstate. On my screen, the blips began to turn. One by one, they peeled off the digital representation of the main highway and onto the non-existent exit ramp. I watched, horrified, as the lead truck in the real world did the same. It didn't slow down, it didn't signal, it simply veered to the right, its dim headlights pointing away from the road, and drove straight into the side of the mountain. It didn't crash. There was no explosion, no shower of sparks, no screech of tortured metal. It just phased through the rock and disappeared. It was like watching a ghost walk through a wall. It was a smooth, seamless, and utterly impossible event. The second truck followed, then the third and the fourth. Each one in turn drove silently into the solid rock face and vanished from sight, their taillights winking out as they were swallowed by the ancient stone of the Smokies. The last truck in the phantom convoy, a hulking, rust-covered tanker, approached the mountain wall. For a fleeting moment, its taillights glowed a brighter red, and I had the insane, terrifying thought that it was braking for me, inviting me to follow them into the rock, into whatever spectral realm they inhabited. Then it too was gone. And then there was silence. The low hum vanished, the smell of old diesel faded. The road ahead was empty. I looked at my GPS. All the blips were gone. It was just me again, a lone icon on a dark screen, a solitary witness in the suffocating fog. I drove for another mile before I saw the blessed blue sign for a rest stop. I pulled in, my body shaking so uncontrollably I could barely steer. I killed the engine and sat there, in the sudden, deafening silence, my hands trembling in my lap. I sat there until dawn, watching the fog slowly burn away to reveal the majestic green and solid slopes of the mountains. I tried to rationalize it. A mass hallucination brought on by fatigue and the disorienting fog. A sophisticated holographic prank. But I knew what I saw. I saw the trucks. I saw the drivers. I saw them drive into a mountain, and my GPS, my trusted, logical GPS, had seen them too. I couldn't let it go. When I got to Charlotte, I spent my entire layover in a hotel room digging through online archives. I searched for trucking accidents, I-40, Great Smoky Mountains. I found stories, local legends whispered on old trucker forums. Decades ago, before the interstate was blasted through the mountains, there was an old, treacherous two-lane road that followed a similar path. A road that was notorious for accidents. One story, pieced together from a digitized newspaper archive from the late 1940s, hit me like a physical blow. It told of a terrible incident involving a convoy of independent truckers, wildcatters, who were hauling untaxed contraband liquor out of the Tennessee hills. They were running at night in a thick fog, trying to evade revenue agents. There was a sudden landslide, a whole section of the mountain giving way in the rain-soaked darkness. 10 trucks, 10 drivers, all buried under thousands of tons of rock and earth. They were never recovered. Their tomb was the mountain itself. The article even listed the coordinates of the disaster. With trembling hands, I plugged the coordinates into my GPS. The pin dropped on the map. It was the exact spot. The exact spot where the interstate now runs. The exact spot where the phantom convoy had turned off the highway and driven home. I still drive that route. I have to. It's my job, but now I don't trust my technology as much as I used to. Or maybe I trust it more. I know there are things out there that can't be measured or tracked by normal means, things that operate on a different frequency, that leave a different kind of data trail. And every time I pass that spot in the Smokies, especially when the fog is thick, I turn my CB radio off, I glance away from my GPS, and I hold my breath, praying to a God I'm not sure I believe in, that the road behind me stays empty. My name is Daniel Price. I'm 42 and I've been hauling loads through the Appalachian heartland for most of my adult life. I specialize in heavy equipment, the big stuff. Bulldozers, excavators, mining machinery. My route often takes me along US Route 23, the so-called country music highway. But to guys like me, it's the spine of coal country. It's a road that winds through a landscape of breathtaking beauty and profound poverty, a place where the ghosts of the past feel very, very close to the surface. I've always deep respect for these mountains and the people who live and die by them. But one night, that respect turned into a cold, hard fear that I carry with me to this day. It was a moonless night in early spring. I was driving north through eastern Kentucky, my flatbed loaded with a brand new continuous mining machine destined for a site near Pikeville. The machine was a monster, a multi-ton beast of steel and tungsten carbide, and hauling it required my full concentration. The road was dark, flanked by steep wooded hillsides and the occasional darkened silhouette of a coal tipple. This is a land that has given up its riches, and sometimes it feels like it's taken the souls of the people in return. You can feel the weight of history here, the echoes of disasters, strikes, and hard-won lives. I was coming down a long, steep grade when my headlights caught something on the shoulder ahead. It was a man standing perfectly still. This wasn't entirely unusual. You see people walking these roads at all hours. But there was something off about him, something that made the hairs on my arms stand up. As I got closer, the details came into focus and my unease sharpened into genuine alarm. He was dressed in old-fashioned miner's gear, not the modern stuff with reflective stripes and hard hats, but clothes from another time. He wore heavy canvas trousers, thick boots caked in mud, and a simple flannel shirt under a worn jacket. On his head was a soft cap, the kind they wore before hard hats were mandatory, with a small, flickering carbide lamp mounted on the front. The flame from the lamp cast a weak, dancing light on his face. I slowed the truck, my curiosity warring with a primal instinct to speed up and get away. He wasn't trying to flag me down. He was just standing there, his body angled towards the dark, wooded hillside across the road. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped as if carrying an immense weight. It was his face that stopped my heart. It was covered in a thick layer of coal dust, so black it seemed to absorb the light from my headlights. But it was his eyes. I'll never forget his eyes as long as I live. He turned his head as I approached, and his gaze met mine through the windshield. His eyes were wide, staring, but they weren't eyes at all. They were hollows. Two dark, empty sockets in his blackened face, voids that seemed to pull in all the light and hope in the world. There was no anger or malice in them, just a profound, endless emptiness, the look of a man who has seen the horrors of the deep earth and left a part of himself behind in the darkness. I felt a jolt of pure terror, a cold dread that started in my gut and spread through my entire body. My foot, which had been hovering over the brake, slammed down on the accelerator. I just wanted to be gone. As my rig thundered past him, I risked a glance in my side mirror. He was still standing there, but he had raised one arm, his hand caked in grime. He was pointing. Not at me, but across the road up the steep, overgrown hillside. He held the pose for a moment, a silent, spectral signpost before the darkness swallowed him once more. My heart was hammering like a trip hammer. I drove for another 10 miles before my hands stopped shaking enough to safely pull over. I got out of the cab, the cool night air doing little to calm my racing pulse. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, a local eccentric, anything but what I knew deep down it was. The image of those hollow eyes was burned into my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling, the way he pointed. It was deliberate, meaningful. Against my better judgment, I felt a morbid compulsion to know more. The next day, after I dropped off my load in Pikeville, I stopped at an old diner, the kind of place where the locals have been drinking the same coffee for 50 years. I sat at the counter and, trying to sound casual, I described the stretch of road where I'd seen the man. An old-timer sitting a few stools down, a man with a face like a road map of the local coal seams, overheard me. He put his coffee cup down and looked at me with knowing eyes. "You saw him then," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The pointer." My blood ran cold. "The pointer?" He nodded slowly. "Been seen on that stretch of road for nigh on 80 years. Always the same, dressed in the old gear, pointing up at the hill." He told me the story. In the 1930s, there was a small independent mine on that hillside, a dog-hole mine as they called them, poorly supported, unregulated, and incredibly dangerous. One rainy afternoon, there was a catastrophic collapse. A methane explosion followed by a cave-in. A dozen men were working the seam that day. None of them made it out. The rescue effort was a nightmare. The mine was too unstable to enter. The company that owned it went bankrupt, and the families were left with nothing but a sealed-up hole in the side of a mountain for a gravestone. They never recovered the bodies. One of the men, the old-timer continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, was a young fella named Silas. It was his first week on the job. They say his wife and kids waited at the mine entrance for days, hoping for a miracle. They say his spirit can't rest, can't leave, until his body is brought out of that hill and given a proper burial. He told me that every now and then a driver at night sees him, standing by the road, pointing, always pointing at the spot where the entrance to the lost mine is, now completely overgrown and forgotten by all but the oldest locals. "He's not trying to scare anyone," the old man said. "He's just asking for help. He's pointing the way home." I finished my coffee in silence, the diner's cheerful chatter fading into a dull buzz. The story settled over me like a shroud of coal dust. The hollow eyes of the miner weren't empty because of hate. They were empty because his soul was still trapped in the suffocating darkness of the earth, a mile deep under the mountain. He wasn't a monster. He was a lost soul, forever pointing the way to his own tomb. I drove back down Route 23 that evening, my flatbed empty. As I approached the spot, I slowed my truck down. I pulled over to the shoulder and killed the engine. I got out and stood in the same spot where I had seen him. The night was quiet, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. I looked across the road at the dark, impenetrable wall of trees and undergrowth. I couldn't see any sign of an old mine, just a steep, wild hillside. But I knew it was there. I could feel it. I could feel the weight of those dozen souls buried and forgotten. I stood there for a long time, a silent vigil on the side of the road. I didn't see him again. But I said a quiet prayer for Silas, and for all the others who were lost to the deep dark. A prayer that they might one day find their peace. I still drive that road. It's my job, but I never pass that spot without thinking of him. Sometimes when the light is just right, I think I can see a slight depression in the hillside, a place where the earth settled long ago. I no longer feel terror when I think of him. Now it's a profound sadness. I am one of the few who knows his secret, who has seen his silent plea. I am a witness to the ghost of the coal country, the hollow-eyed man who just wants to go home. If this story gave you chills, smash the like button and drop a comment below. Another horrifying tale is waiting. Let's continue. My name is Angela Moore, but everyone who knows me calls me Angie. I'm 29, and for the last 5 years my home has been the cab of a Peterbilt 579. I got into this life for the independence, for the feeling of being the captain of my own ship, beholden to no one but the open road and the tyranny of the schedule. I'm not easily spooked. I've learned to be tough, to be self-reliant. I've slept soundly in my cab in some of the sketchiest, most run-down truck stops in America, the kind where you lock your doors and your fuel tanks. I've dealt with aggressive drivers trying to run me off the road, and I've navigated through storms that would make most people pull over and pray to a God they don't believe in. My philosophy has always been simple. The most dangerous things in this world are people, not spirits. A man with bad intentions is a real threat. A ghost is just a story. But a storm-tossed night in the deep, dark backwoods of West Virginia taught me a hard lesson. It taught me that some places hold a darkness that has nothing to do with people at all. It's a memory that now flickers in the back of my mind like a dying candle, a constant chilling reminder that some lights are better left uninvestigated and some cries are better left unheard. I was hauling a load of dry goods, a routine run making its way through the winding 2-lane highways that snake through the Appalachian highlands. It was late autumn, that time of year when the mountains are shedding their fiery colors and preparing for the long, cold sleep of winter. The weather, which had been clear all day, turned nasty with a sudden, shocking violence. A fierce thunderstorm rolled in off the ridges, the kind that feels biblical. The sky turned a bruised, angry, purple-black. The rain wasn't just falling, it was coming down in solid wind-driven sheets that overwhelmed my wipers the second they cleared the glass. A relentless, blinding curtain of water. Thunder cracked overhead, not a distant rumble but a sharp, explosive concussion so loud and close it felt like the sky was being torn apart right above my cab. The lightning wasn't just flashes, it was great, jagged forks that illuminated the entire landscape in brief, terrifying, stark white tableaus. The road had become a treacherous black ribbon of water, and my heavy truck was starting to feel dangerously light, threatening to hydroplane with every gust of wind. It was too dangerous to continue. My GPS, usually my lifeline, was useless out here. The screen just showed a gray void with the words, "Acquiring satellite signal." I was relying on an old-fashioned paper map, a relic I kept in my glove box for just such an occasion. My plan was simple: find a safe place to pull over and wait out the storm. But on these narrow, winding roads, a safe place was a luxury. The shoulders were soft, muddy, and sloped dangerously towards deep ditches. Up ahead, my headlights, struggling against the deluge, picked out a narrow, unpaved track leading off the main road. It looked like an old logging road, a muddy, rutted path disappearing into the blackness of the forest. On a normal night, I wouldn't have dreamed of taking my 18-wheeler down a path like that. It was a recipe for getting stuck, for sinking up to my axles in mud. But just as I was about to pass it, a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the scene. And in that split second of divine, terrifying light, I saw a small clearing about 100 yards in. It was flat, and it looked just big enough for my rig. It was a gamble, but it was better than being a sitting duck on the highway, a massive metal target in a lightning storm. With a deep breath, I made my decision. Carefully, I eased my truck off the asphalt, the transition a jarring lurch as the tires hit the soft, muddy ground. The rig groaned and protested. The tires spun in the muck, the engine whining as I fought for traction. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I had made a terrible mistake. But then the tires caught and I managed to coax the truck forward into the relative safety of the clearing. I maneuvered the rig until it was clear of the track and shut down the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. The roar of the diesel was gone, replaced by the relentless, hypnotic drumming of rain on the roof of my cab and the distant guttural rumble of thunder. I was surrounded by total, absolute darkness. To save the battery for the long wait ahead, I killed my headlights. The world outside vanished. I was plunged into a blackness so complete, so profound, it felt like I was at the bottom of the ocean. It was a disorienting, claustrophobic darkness. I settled in for what I knew would be a long wait. I poured a cup of lukewarm coffee from my thermos, the familiar bitterness a small comfort. I scrolled through old photos on my phone, looking at pictures of my family, of my dog, trying to bring a little light and warmth into the cold, dark cab. An hour passed. The storm showed no signs of letting up. The initial feeling of relief at being off the road had faded, replaced by a growing sense of isolation and a creeping claustrophobia. The cab, usually my spacious kingdom, was starting to feel like a cage. I peered out the windshield, trying to see anything beyond the rain-streaked glass and my own faint reflection. Another brilliant, jagged fork of lightning lit up the world, and in that split second of stark black-and-white reality, I saw it. Deep in the woods, maybe a quarter-mile from my position, nestled in a hollow I hadn't even known was there, stood a cabin. It was small and dilapidated, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie. The wood was weathered to a ghostly gray. The porch roof was sagging precariously, and the whole structure seemed to be leaning to one side, as if exhausted from its long battle with gravity. But that wasn't what made my breath catch in my throat. In that brief, stark illumination, I saw a light in one of the windows. A single, steady yellow light. My first reaction was a jolt of pure relief. Someone else was out here. I wasn't completely alone in this wilderness. Maybe they had a phone that worked, or a weather radio. Maybe they were friendly folk who'd offer a cup of hot coffee. But that relief, that hopeful little spark, was quickly extinguished, curdling into confusion and then into a creeping, undeniable sense of dread. The cabin looked utterly derelict, a ruin. Who would be living in a place like that, so deep in the woods with no proper road leading to it? And why was only one light on? It wasn't the warm, multi-window glow of an occupied home. It was a solitary, watchful eye in the darkness. I couldn't look away. I kept watching the spot where I'd seen it, my face pressed close to the cold glass of the window, waiting for the next flash of lightning. When it came, it confirmed what I'd seen. The cabin was there, a dark, hunched shape against the thrashing, wind-whipped trees. And the light was still there, a faint, unwavering pinprick in the oppressive darkness. It wasn't the flickering, dancing light of a candle or a gas lamp. It had the steady, dull, unwavering glow of an old incandescent bulb. This is where my logical mind, the part of me that believes in physics and reason, started fighting a losing battle with my growing fear. For a light bulb to work, you need electricity. I scanned the landscape with every lightning flash. There were no power lines out here. I hadn't seen a single utility pole since I left the main highway miles back. A generator, maybe? That was the next logical step. But I couldn't hear the telltale chug-chug-chug of a generator over the storm, and the light seemed so calm, so peaceful, so utterly out of place in the violent chaos of the weather. I couldn't take my eyes off it. It was mesmerizing, a tiny, impossible beacon of supposed civilization in the middle of a savage wilderness. I found myself making up stories to explain it, desperate attempts by my rational brain to reassert control. It was an old hermit, a recluse who lived off the grid and had a silent solar-powered battery system. It was a group of hunters holed up in their cabin running a quiet inverter generator. But none of the explanations felt right. They felt thin and flimsy, like the lies you tell yourself when you're a child scared of the dark, trying to convince yourself that the monster in the closet is just a pile of clothes. As I sat there staring, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts, a new sound reached me. It cut through the steady rhythm of the rain. It was faint, and at first I thought it was just the wind moaning through the trees in a peculiar way. But it was more structured than that. It was music, a tinny, repetitive, melancholy melody like an old-timey waltz being played on a scratchy, wind-up phonograph. The sound was thin and ghostly, winding its way through the trees, seeming to come from the direction of the cabin. The combination of the steady, impossible light and the phantom music sent a genuine physical shiver down my spine. This was wrong. Everything about this situation was profoundly, fundamentally wrong. The urge to just start my engine and risk the storm-drenched highway was immense, a screaming instinct to flee. But the thought of trying to back my 80,000-pound rig out of this muddy clearing in the pitch black with the trees clawing at my trailer was just as terrifying. I was trapped, a spectator to a scene I couldn't comprehend and couldn't escape. Then something changed. The light in the window, which had been so unnervingly steady for the better part of an hour, flickered once, twice, and then with a final weak pulse it went out. The darkness that rushed in to fill its place was somehow deeper, more absolute than before. The woods, which had held a single point of reference, now felt like an infinite, empty, and menacing void. The ghostly music had stopped. The silence was broken only by the storm. I held my breath, my eyes glued to the spot where the light had been, my heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs, and then I heard the cry. It wasn't loud. It was a thin, mournful, ethereal wail that seemed to be carried on the wind itself. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated despair, a cry of loss so profound, so utterly heartbroken it made the hair on my neck and arms stand on end. It sounded like a woman, but the sound was stretched and distorted by the storm, echoing through the trees in a way that was deeply, horribly unnatural. The cry rose in pitch, a keening, sorrowful note that held for a heartbreaking moment, and then it faded away, swallowed by a deafening, ground-shaking clap of thunder. That was it for me. The dam of my composure broke. Logic, reason, and pragmatism went out the window, replaced by a single primal, overwhelming need to flee. I didn't care about the mud. I didn't care about the storm. I didn't care about the risk of jackknifing. I fumbled for the ignition, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the key in. The engine roared to life, and its familiar, powerful rumble was the most beautiful and comforting sound I had ever heard. My headlights blazed on, cutting a swath of brilliant, reassuring white through the rain and darkness. I threw the truck into reverse, my eyes fixed on my mirrors, and I prayed. The tires spun, throwing great rooster tails of mud and water everywhere, and for a second I thought I was stuck. But then they caught. I backed out of the clearing and onto the narrow track, the branches of trees scraping and screeching along the side of my trailer like skeletal fingers trying to hold me back. I didn't stop until my wheels hit the blessed, solid asphalt of the highway. I cranked the wheel, put the truck in gear, and I drove. I didn't care which direction I was going, I just drove. I drove for 2 hours, my adrenaline slowly, painfully ebbing away, leaving me exhausted and shaky to my very core. The storm eventually passed, moving on to terrorize some other part of the mountains, and the first gray, watery light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. I found a proper, brightly lit truck stop, pulled in, and finally allowed myself to stop. I sat there for a long time, watching the sun come up, watching other trucks come and go, trying to process the events of the night. A few weeks later, I was at a depot in Ohio talking to a veteran trucker, a guy named Earl, who had been running these mountain roads since before I was born. On a whim, I told him the story, half expecting him to laugh at me, to call me a hysterical rookie. He didn't. He just listened patiently, his face grim, nodding slowly as I spoke. When I finished, he took a long, slow sip of his coffee. "Sounds like you found the Miller place," he said, his voice low and gravelly. He told me about a local legend in that part of West Virginia, a story his own grandfather had told him. The story of a family, the Millers, who lived in that remote cabin back in the 1920s. The husband, John, was a logger. One night during a terrible storm, just like the one I had been in, he went out to clear a fallen tree that was blocking the track. A widowmaker, a large broken branch, snapped under the strain of the wind and fell, killing him instantly. His wife, Elspeth, driven half-mad with grief, refused to believe he was gone. She was convinced he was just lost in the storm. So every night she would light a single electric lamp in the window. They had one of the first residential generators in the county, a source of great pride. And she would play their favorite song, a sad waltz, on a wind-up phonograph. She was waiting for him to see the light and hear the music and find his way home. One night, about a year after her husband's death, the cabin caught fire. Some say a log shifted in the fireplace. Others say she knocked over a kerosene lamp in her grief-stricken, sleepless state. The cabin was so remote that by the time anyone saw the glow of the flames against the clouds, it was too late. The woman perished in the fire, still waiting for a husband who would never return. "They say," Earl said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "that on stormy nights her spirit still waits. She doesn't know she's dead. She turns on the light, she plays the music, hoping he'll finally come home. And when the storm gets bad, when the thunder claps just right, she remembers the fire, she remembers the pain. The light goes out and she cries out for him all over again just before the flames take her." I haven't been back to that part of West Virginia. I tell my dispatcher to give me different routes now, even if they're longer. I'll take a hit on my mileage bonus. It's worth it. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night and a bad storm rolls in, I think about that cabin. I think about that single, lonely, impossible light. I think about that ghostly, heartbreaking music. And I think about that cry of pure, eternal despair. And I am reminded that there are worse things than being alone in the dark. The worst thing is to be waiting for a light that will never lead you home. My name is Victor Shaw. I'm 47 and I'm a talker. Always have been. My wife says I could talk the ears off a cornstalk. Out here on the road, that can be a blessing. The long hours of solitude can get to you, and I've always found that a good conversation, even with a stranger over the CB, can make the miles go by faster. I'm also the kind of guy who'll stop to help someone. Flat tire, out of gas, needing a ride. I'm your man. It's just how I'm wired. But one foggy evening in the mountains of North Carolina, I picked up a passenger who taught me that sometimes silence is more powerful than any words, and some acts of kindness are repaid in ways you can't possibly imagine. I was hauling a load of lumber up US 19 heading towards Tennessee. It's a beautiful but demanding road full of sharp curves, steep grades, and breathtaking drop-offs. A heavy fog had settled into the valleys, clinging to the road and reducing visibility to 100 feet or so. It was the kind of weather that makes you lean forward, tense up, and focus on nothing but the white line at the edge of the pavement. I was rounding a bend when my headlights picked him out of the gloom. He was standing on the narrow shoulder, his thumb out. He was a young man, probably college-aged, wearing a simple jacket, jeans, and carrying a small backpack. He looked clean-cut, not like some of the rougher characters you see trying to catch a ride. He just looked like a kid who was stuck. Normally, my company has a strict no-riders policy, insurance, liability, all that corporate stuff. But looking at this kid standing on the edge of a dangerous road in the deepening fog, miles from anywhere, I couldn't just leave him. I made a snap decision. I slowed my rig. the air brake sighing, and pulled over just ahead of him. He jogged up to the passenger door, a look of immense relief on his face. I leaned over and pushed the door open. "Where you headed, son?" I asked. "Just trying to get to the next town, sir," he said, his voice polite and quiet. "My car gave out a few miles back. I'd be grateful for any ride at all." "Climb in," I said with a smile. "It's a nasty night to be walking." He got in, setting his backpack at his feet. "Thank you, sir." "Thank you so much. My name's Adam." "Victor," I replied, pulling the truck back onto the road. "Glad to help." I immediately launched into my usual routine. I asked him where he was from, where he was going, what he was studying if he was in college. I was trying to fill the silence to make him feel comfortable. But he was unusually quiet. His answers were short, almost evasive. He'd just nod or say, "Yes, sir," or give a one-word answer. He spent most of his time staring straight ahead, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I figured he was just shy, or maybe shaken up from his car breaking down. So I did what I do best. I filled the silence for both of us. I told him stories about the road, about close calls I'd had, about the weirdest load I ever hauled, a truck full of rubber chickens, if you must know. I talked about my family, my kids, my plans for retirement. He just sat there, a silent, still presence in the seat next to me, occasionally giving a small nod. The fog was getting thicker, and the road was becoming more treacherous. We were entering a section known for being particularly dangerous, a series of blind curves and switchbacks carved into the side of the mountain. On one side was a solid rock wall, on the other a guardrail and a long, dark drop into the valley below. As we approached the first of these tight curves, the kid, Adam, suddenly spoke. His voice was different now. It had lost its quiet politeness and was filled with an urgent, commanding tone that startled me. "You need to slow down," he said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I was already going slow, maybe 25 miles an hour, but his tone was so insistent that I instinctively eased my foot off the accelerator. "It's a bad corner, I know," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "Slower," he insisted, his voice low and intense. "Brake." Now, there was something in his voice, an authority that defied argument. I tapped the brakes, slowing the rig to a crawl, maybe 15 miles an hour. The truck groaned as we began to navigate the blind curve. My eyes were glued to the road, my hands tight on the wheel. "Be ready," he whispered, his voice barely audible, and then we rounded the curve. My blood turned to ice. The road ahead was gone. A massive rock slide had completely obliterated the highway. Boulders the size of my truck, along with a cascade of smaller rocks and uprooted trees, covered both lanes. If I had been going my normal speed, even my cautious 25 miles an hour, I would have had no time to react. My rig would have plowed straight into that wall of rock and earth. The momentum would have carried me through the guardrail and over the edge into the black abyss. There is no question in my mind I would have been killed. I slammed on the brakes with all my might. The truck screeched and shuddered, the trailer threatening to jackknife, but because I was already going so slow, I managed to bring the rig to a stop with maybe 10 feet to spare. My front bumper was almost touching a massive, jagged boulder. I sat there, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was shaking from head to toe, flooded with a mixture of terror and adrenaline. I had been seconds, mere feet, from a violent death. After a moment that felt like an eternity, I turned to the passenger seat to thank the kid, to thank Adam for saving my life. But the seat was empty. The cab was empty. The passenger door was closed. His backpack was gone. He had vanished. I stared at the empty seat, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. It was impossible. I had been stopped for maybe 5 seconds. He couldn't have gotten out that fast, that silently. I would have heard the door open, felt the rush of cold air, but there was nothing. He was just gone. I stumbled out of the cab, my legs weak and unsteady. I looked around in the fog. "Adam?" I called out, my voice hoarse. "Adam!" There was no answer. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the faint dripping of water from the rock face. I walked around my truck. No sign of him. He had disappeared as completely and silently as a ghost. It took me a while to compose myself enough to get on the CB radio and report the rock slide. It took hours for road crews to arrive and begin the long process of clearing the highway. During that time, I told my story to a state trooper who was first on the scene. I told him about the hitchhiker, Adam, who had warned me to slow down and then disappeared. The IEW trooper listened patiently, then gave me a strange, sympathetic look. "A lot of weird things happen in these mountains, driver," he said. "You're a lucky man. Whoever he was or whatever he was, you should be grateful." He was right. I was lucky. I was alive. But the mystery of it haunted me. Was he a ghost? A guardian angel? Had I been so stressed by the fog that I had imagined him, my own subconscious, screaming a warning at me? But he felt so real. The weight of him in the seat, the polite quietness, the sudden life-saving urgency in his voice. I never found an answer. There were no other reports of a young man on that road. No abandoned car was ever found. It was as if he had dropped out of the sky to save my life and then returned to wherever he came from. I still pick up hitchhikers. The company policy can go to hell. I feel like I'm paying a debt. But now I'm a little more attentive to the quiet ones. I listen to the silence as much as I listen to the chatter. And every time I approach a blind curve in the fog, I ease off the accelerator and I whisper a quiet thank you to Adam, the hitchhiker who was there and then wasn't, the guardian angel who appeared on a lonely road and disappeared at the next curve, leaving behind the greatest gift of all, my life. My name is Patricia Long. I'm 38, and if you cut me open, you'd probably find diesel fuel and logistics tables instead of blood and guts. I'm a pragmatist, a realist. In my line of work, hauling temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals on schedules so tight they squeak, you don't have the luxury of being anything else. Time is money, but for me, time is also viability. A delay of a few hours can turn a $500,000 shipment of life-saving medicine into a worthless, spoiled slurry. I believe in preventative maintenance in tire pressure, in the unwavering reliability of my Kenworth T680, and in the cold, hard data my GPS provides. I don't believe in ghost stories, local legends, or the kind of campfire tales other drivers swap at 3 a.m. to keep themselves awake. The world is governed by physics and deadlines, not by spirits and superstitions. At least that was the world I lived in before a desperate shortcut near Asheville, North Carolina, dragged me into a place where the past isn't just dead and buried. It's trapped, it's screaming, and it's trying to get out. The run was cursed from the start. It was a hot-shot load, critical and time-sensitive, from a supplier in Knoxville to a major hospital in Charlotte. The kind of run where everything has to go perfectly. Naturally, nothing did. A paperwork snafu at the depot delayed my departure by a precious 90 minutes. Then just outside Knoxville, I-40 turned into a parking lot. A fender bender involving a tourist's RV and a pickup truck had traffic at a dead stop for miles. I sat there, fuming, watching the digital clock on my dashboard tick away the minutes, each one a small nail in the coffin of my schedule. The refrigerated unit on my trailer hummed, a constant reminder of the delicate, expensive cargo whose viability was slowly degrading with every passing second. After 2 hours of crawling, my GPS, that blessed digital heart of my operation, offered a glimmer of hope. It chirped, recalculated, and presented a detour. a winding route of state highways and county roads that would snake through the dark, hilly country west of Asheville, bypassing the gridlock entirely. In theory, it would save me at least an hour, maybe more. It was a route I'd never taken, a spiderweb of unfamiliar back roads. My gut, the part of me that's all old-school trucker, screamed, bad idea. Stick to the main roads, the known quantities. But the pragmatist, the woman with the ticking clock and the temperature-sensitive cargo, overruled it. An hour was an hour. I took the exit. The world changed almost immediately. The wide, well-lit interstate gave way to narrow two-lane highways where the yellow lines were faded and the shoulders were soft. The sun had set, and a deep, profound rural darkness fell like a blanket. The trees, ancient and thick, pressed in on either side, their branches forming a canopy that blotted out the stars. My headlights cut a lonely tunnel through a world that felt utterly empty. It was just me, the low rumble of my engine and the endless twisting asphalt. For a while, my gamble seemed to be paying off. I was making good time, the empty roads a welcome relief after the stagnant interstate. The tension in my shoulders began to ease. Maybe I'd make it after all. My GPS chimed again. In a quarter mile, turn right. The road it wanted me to turn onto was barely a road at all. It was a narrow, cracked asphalt track that looked more like a forgotten driveway than a county-maintained route. An old, rusted sign, half swallowed by a thick curtain of ivy, pointed the way. The words Helen's Bridge were barely legible in the peeling paint. The road itself led directly toward the mouth of a short, stone-arched tunnel. I slowed the rig to a crawl, a shiver of pure, unadulterated reluctance running through me. The tunnel was a monstrosity. It looked ancient, built from massive, rough-hewn stones that were blackened with a century of grime and dampness. Water seeped from the cracks, leaving dark, ugly stains on the stone. It was a dark, gaping maw in the side of the hill, and it didn't look like an engineering project. It looked like a wound. It looked like the entrance to something old, angry, and best left undisturbed. Recalculating, my GPS chirped, its cheerful electronic voice a stark contrast to the menacing sight before me. Then, after a moment, "This is the fastest route. Proceed." The pragmatist in me was at war with every primal instinct I possessed. The thought of that wasted time on the interstate, the image of my dispatcher's angry face, the potential loss of the cargo, it all pushed me forward. "It's just a tunnel, Trish," I muttered aloud, my own voice sounding small and thin in the vast darkness. 100 yards of stone and asphalt, get a grip." I took a deep breath, geared down, and aimed my rig for the opening. The moment my front bumper crossed the threshold, the world changed. It wasn't a gradual shift, it was instantaneous, like flipping a switch. The air in my cab, which had been a comfortable 70 degrees, suddenly became thick, heavy, and oppressively cold. It was a damp, cellar-like cold, the kind that feels like it's seeping right into your bones, making your teeth ache. I glanced at my thermostat. It still read 70, but the air I was breathing was frigid. My radio, which had been playing a local country station, a cheerful tune about beer and pickup trucks, erupted in a burst of violent, shrieking static. It wasn't the gentle hiss of a lost signal. It was a sound so loud, so harsh and aggressive, it was like a physical assault. I flinched, my hand darting out to slam the power button, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs. The sudden, profound silence that followed was somehow worse. The tunnel was short, maybe only 100 yards long, but it felt like a mile. The stone walls, slick with a slimy greenish moisture, seemed to close in on me. The darkness inside was absolute, a living, breathing blackness that my powerful LED headlights could barely penetrate. They seemed to be swallowed by the gloom just a few feet in front of my grill. The acoustics were all wrong. The familiar, comforting rumble of my Kenworth's engine sounded muffled and distant, as if it were happening somewhere else, a memory of a sound rather than the real thing. The only sound was the soft thump-thump of my own terrified heart. And then the screaming started. It began as a single high-pitched wail, a woman's shriek of pure terror that seemed to come from directly in front of my truck. I slammed on the brakes instinctively, my mind screaming accident, my eyes scanning the gloom for a person, a crashed car, anything. But there was nothing. The road ahead was empty. Before I could process that first scream, it was joined by another, then another. Within seconds, the air was filled with them. It wasn't just a few screams, it was a chorus, a cacophony of hundreds of terrified, agonized voices, all crying out at once. They were inside my cab, they were outside my cab, they were in my head. It was the sound of pure, undiluted terror and pain, a symphony of damnation. I could distinguish individual voices in the horrifying choir. The deep guttural roar of a man in agony, the high, piercing shriek of a woman in mortal fear, the thin, reedy, heartbreaking cries of children. It was the sound of 100 final moments all happening at once, a tidal wave of spectral agony washing over me. The sound was so real, so visceral, that I physically recoiled, pressing myself back into my seat as if I could escape it. I clapped my hands over my ears, pressing so hard my head ached, but it did nothing to block out the noise. It wasn't just sound waves hitting my eardrums, it was inside me, vibrating in my bones, echoing in the hollows of my skull. I could feel the raw emotion behind the screams, the terror, the pain, the hopeless final realization that death had come. Panic, cold and sharp and total, seized me. My rational mind was gone, vaporized by the sheer impossibility of what was happening. These were not echoes. They were the screams of the dying, and they were happening now. As the screams reached a fever pitch, a crescendo of pure horror, my truck's electronics went haywire. The dashboard, my beautiful, reliable array of digital readouts and gauges, flickered erratically and died. The screens went black. My digital speedometer, my fuel gauge, my temperature readings, all gone. The warm, comforting glow of the dash was replaced by an unnerving darkness. Then my headlights blinked off. The world vanished. I was plunged into a terrifying, absolute blackness. A sensory deprivation so complete that I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed. The only thing that existed was the screaming. For a split second that stretched into an eternity, I was blind, trapped in a metal box, surrounded by the voices of the damned. Then the headlights sputtered back on, flickering weakly. The engine, my faithful Cummins, coughed and sputtered, the RPMs dropping erratically. The whole rig shuddered, a violent, convulsive tremor as if it were having a seizure. It felt like some external, malevolent force was attacking its very nervous system, trying to kill it from the inside out. I did the only thing I could do. I reacted. My foot, which had been frozen on the brake, stomped down on the accelerator. I didn't care about the engine, the electronics, or the cargo. I just wanted out. Out of the cold. Out of the screaming. Out of that cursed, unholy place. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever. The exit a distant, mocking pinprick of light that never seemed to get any closer. The screams followed me, clawing at me, a wave of spectral agony that seemed to be physically pushing against my truck, trying to hold me back. I could almost feel phantom hands pressing against the glass, hear ghostly fingers scraping at the paint. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. My truck burst out of the other side of the tunnel and back into the quiet, sane North Carolina night. The second my trailer cleared the stone archway, it was like a switch was flipped again. The screaming stopped, cut off with an unnatural suddenness. The oppressive, bone-deep cold in the cab vanished, instantly replaced by the normal conditioned air. My dashboard lights flickered back to life, all the gauges and screens rebooting and returning to normal. The engine smoothed out, its steady, powerful rumble a comforting, beautiful reassurance. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I kept my foot pressed to the floor, my eyes wide, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. I was shaking so violently that the whole cab seemed to vibrate, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. I drove for another 15 minutes, putting as much distance as possible between me and that tunnel before I saw a wide, well-lit spot on the side of the road next to a closed-down fruit stand. I pulled over, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. I swung the door open and practically fell out of the cab, my legs buckling under me. I landed on my hands and knees on the gravel shoulder, gasping for the cool night air, my stomach heaving. I stayed there for a long time, just breathing, trying to get my heart rate back to something resembling normal. I had never in my life been so terrified. It was a fear that went beyond the physical, a deep soul-level terror that left me feeling violated and unclean. When my breathing finally steadied and my legs felt like they could hold me, I pushed myself up. I leaned against the side of my truck, the cool metal a comforting, solid presence. My mind was a whirlwind. Had I imagined it? A waking nightmare brought on by stress and fatigue? A hallucination? I needed proof. I needed something tangible to anchor me back to reality. I did a walk around of my rig, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. I was checking for damage from the electrical fit, but really I was looking for something else. The engine was humming perfectly. The lights were all bright and steady. It was as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. And I found the proof when my flashlight beam fell on the passenger side of my cab. I stopped dead. The side of my truck, from the passenger door all the way down the 53-foot length of my gleaming white trailer, was covered in handprints. They were clearly visible in the thin layer of road dust that had accumulated during my drive. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They weren't smudges or smears, they were distinct, desperate prints. The prints of men with large, wide palms, the prints of women with slender fingers, and most horrifyingly, the tiny, perfect prints of children. They were pressed against the metal at all heights, from down near the tires to as high as a person could reach. Some were perfect and clear, every line and whorl visible. Others were smeared downwards, as if the hands had been sliding down the side of my truck as I sped away. They were the handprints of a crowd, a desperate, pleading, terrified crowd, reaching out from the darkness of the tunnel, trying to grab onto something solid, something real, something that was escaping their hell. I stared at them, my stomach churning, a fresh wave of nausea washing over me. I reached out a trembling finger and touched the edge of one of the smaller prints. A child's handprint right on the passenger door at the height where a small child would be standing. It was just an outline in the dust, but it was undeniable proof. Proof that I wasn't crazy. Proof that what I had experienced was terrifyingly, impossibly real. I spent the rest of the night right there on the side of the road, too afraid to move, too afraid to be alone in the dark again. I just sat in my cab, the lights on, the engine running, until the first gray light of dawn broke the horizon. Later, when I was safely in Charlotte and the sun was shining with a cheerful, mocking brightness, I sat in my hotel room and opened my laptop. I looked up, Helen's Bridge, Asheville. The local legends came flooding through my screen. The most common story was about a woman named Helen, who had lost her beloved daughter in a fire. Distraught and consumed by grief, she had gone to the nearby bridge and hanged herself from the stone archway. Her tormented spirit, they say, still haunts the tunnel, and if you call her name, she will appear. But as I dug deeper into old newspaper archives and local history forums, I found other stories. Older, darker stories that the tourist websites didn't mention. One article from the 1940s told of a horrific accident. A chartered bus carrying families home from a church picnic had stalled inside the narrow, unlit tunnel. A drunk driver in a heavy truck going too fast hadn't seen the bus until it was too late. The impact was catastrophic, rupturing the bus's fuel tank. The resulting fire was an inferno trapped within the stone confines of the tunnel. There were no survivors. The screams, the stories said, were the final, agonizing moments of those passengers, trapped forever in an auditory loop, replaying their terror for anyone who dares to drive through. The handprints were them, reaching out, trying to escape the fire, trying to claw their way to safety, leaving their last desperate touch on anything that passed through their world. I made my delivery on time. The cargo was fine. But I wasn't. I lost something more valuable than an hour on that dark road. I lost my comfortable, pragmatic view of the world. I lost the shield of skepticism that had kept me safe and sane. I cleaned my truck that morning, washing away every single handprint with a high-pressure hose. But I can't wash them from my memory. I can still see them clear as day. I can still hear the screams. I know now that some places are saturated with sorrow and pain, places where a tragedy was so immense it left a permanent scar on the world. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough to take the wrong shortcut on the right night, you'll find that the past isn't past at all. You'll find it's still there, and it screams. My name is Gerald Dawson, but on the CB and in the truck stops, I'm just Jerry. I'm 55 years old, and my spine is shaped like the driver's seat of a Peterbilt, come from a time before the world was mapped by satellites and dictated by a pleasant, disembodied voice from a plastic box on the dash. I learned the roads the old-fashioned way, with a dog-eared, coffee-stained Rand McNally atlas, a memory sharpened by necessity, and a gut feeling for the rhythm of the highway. My internal compass has always been my most reliable tool. I know the back roads of the Appalachians, the forgotten state highways, and winding county roads like the lines on my own hand. I've seen my share of strange things out here in the deep, dark hours. Unexplained lights in the sky, animals that move too fast to be real, fog that seems to have a mind of its own. But I'm a man who believes in logical explanations. Fatigue, tricks of the light, bad weather. There's always an answer if you're sober and sensible enough to find it. Or so I thought. I held that belief for 35 years of driving, a comfortable shield against the kind of stories that make the hair on your arms stand up. But one starless night, in the ancient sleeping mountains of Virginia, I found myself on a road I knew by heart, a road that suddenly decided it wasn't finished with me yet. And it taught me that some things don't have a logical explanation. Some things are just hungry. I was on a familiar run, a routine I could do in my sleep, hauling a refrigerated trailer full of produce up through southwestern Virginia. The destination was a distribution center just over the state line, a straight shot up a state highway I'd driven hundreds, if not thousands, of times. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., that dead, silent time when the world seems to be holding its breath. The road was empty, a black ribbon unfurling into the darkness, and I was making good time. I was in that comfortable, meditative state that long-haul drivers know well, lost in the familiar drone of the diesel engine, the rhythmic thump of the tires on the pavement, and the hypnotic dance of the white lines under my headlights. I passed a landmark I always used to mark my progress, a mental checkpoint on this long, dark stretch. It was a small, whitewashed country church with a particularly tall, sharp steeple that stabbed at the night sky. It was set back from the road, nestled in a grove of ancient, sprawling oak trees. Just past it, nailed to one of those oaks, was an old, rusted-out metal sign for a long-gone brand of chewing tobacco, its red and white paint faded to a ghostly pink and brown. Seeing it was like getting a friendly nod from an old acquaintance. All right, I thought to myself, a familiar comfort settling over me. Another 20 miles to the turnoff for the interstate. Easy run. I took a sip of my lukewarm coffee from the thermos beside me. On the radio, a late-night talk show host was taking calls about conspiracy theories, his voice a low, calming murmur in the quiet of my cab. The miles rolled by. The road twisted and turned through the dark, rolling hills as it always did, each curve a familiar movement, a muscle memory in my hands on the wheel. But after about 15 or 20 minutes of driving, a strange feeling began to prickle at the back of my neck, a nagging sense of déjà vu. The sequence of curves I was navigating, a sharp left followed by a long sweeping right, felt a little too familiar. It felt like I had just driven it. I shook my head, a small, dismissive gesture. "Getting old, Jerry," I muttered. "Fatigue plays tricks on you. At my age, the late-night runs start to wear on you in ways they didn't in my 20s. Your mind starts to loop even when the road doesn't." I kept driving, pushing the feeling away. And then I saw it up ahead, emerging from the darkness, illuminated in the stark white glare of my headlights. The small, whitewashed country church with the tall steeple, and just past it the rusted sign for chewing tobacco. I felt a cold knot tighten in the pit of my stomach. My foot eased off the accelerator. I slowed the truck, my mind racing, trying to process the impossibility. Had I somehow gotten turned around? It seemed impossible. This was a straight highway with no major intersections, no turnoffs I could have taken by mistake. Maybe there were two identical churches, two identical forgotten tobacco signs nailed to a tree. It was a long shot, a one-in-a-million coincidence, but it was the only rational explanation I could come up with. It had to be. I tried to dismiss it, to force the pieces into a logical shape, and kept driving. But this time the easy comfort was gone. I was alert, my eyes scanning the darkness, my knuckles a little tighter on the wheel. I drove for another 20 minutes. The talk radio show had gone to a commercial break, and the silence in the cab felt heavy, charged with a strange, expectant energy. The feeling of unease was growing with every mile. The road felt wrong now. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for my truck. The air in the cab felt thick, difficult to breathe. I checked my mirrors. The road behind me was a black, empty void. There was nothing there, but I felt like I was being watched. And then I saw it again. The church, the steeple, the sign. Panic, cold and electric, shot through me. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't déjà vu. I was in a loop. The road was repeating itself. I slammed on the brakes, my body acting before my mind could even form the thought. The big rig screeched and groaned, coming to a halt in the middle of the deserted highway. I sat there, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird trying to make sense of the impossible. I was trapped in a geographical stutter, a glitch in the fabric of reality. My internal compass, my pride and joy, was spinning uselessly. The road was lying to me, but this time as I stared at the scene, I noticed something was different. I looked closely at the church, my eyes straining in the headlight beams. The whitewash was peeling more than I remembered from the first pass. It was flaking off in large, leprous patches, revealing the dark, weathered wood beneath. A shutter on one of the upstairs windows, which had been perfectly aligned before, was now hanging crookedly from a single hinge, swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. The old tobacco sign seemed rustier, the colors more faded, as if it had aged a decade in the last 20 minutes. The landscape was decaying, it was rotting. A primal fear, the kind I hadn't felt since I was a child, afraid of the monster under the bed, began to creep into my veins. This wasn't just a loop, it was a downward spiral. The road wasn't just repeating, it was degrading. I had to break it. I had to get out. I threw the truck in gear, the grinding sound of violent intrusion into the dead quiet. I stomped on the accelerator, the engine roaring in protest. I was determined to outrun it, to push through to the other side by sheer force of will. I drove faster this time, my eyes wide, scanning every detail, trying to burn the real version of the road into my memory to compare it against the next pass. The road was the same, every curve and dip an exact maddening replica of the last pass. I was a needle on a skipping record, playing the same scratchy, terrifying groove over and over. 20 minutes later, like a scene from a recurring nightmare you can't wake up from, the church appeared again. But this time it was a wreck. It was a skeletal ruin of what it had been. The tall, proud steeple was leaning at a dangerous, drunken angle, looking as if a strong gust of wind would send it crashing to the ground. Great patches of shingles were missing from the roof, leaving dark, gaping holes. The windows were no longer just dark. They were shattered, the empty frames like the hollow eyes of a skull. The tobacco sign was barely hanging onto the tree, almost completely consumed by a crust of angry orange rust. And the mighty oak trees beside the church. They were dead. Their branches were bare and skeletal, black and twisted against the night sky, reaching up like the arms of the damned, though it was the middle of a lush Virginia summer. The world was rotting around me with each pass, and the process was accelerating. I knew then, with a certainty that chilled me to my very soul, that I couldn't outrun it. The road was playing a game with me, a cruel cat-and-mouse game, and I was losing. With each loop, the decay was speeding up. What would the next pass look like? The church collapsed into a pile of rubble, the road itself crumbling into dust beneath my wheels. I felt a crushing, suffocating sense of hopelessness. I was a rat in a maze, and the maze was collapsing in on itself. As I passed the ruined church for the third time, a new, far more terrifying thought wormed its way into my mind. What if the decay wasn't just happening to the world outside my windshield? The truck was part of this loop. I was part of this loop. What if it was happening to my truck? To me? My gaze dropped to my hands on the steering wheel. They weren't my hands. They were the hands of an old man, the skin thin and translucent like parchment, stretched taut over a web of bulging blue veins and gnarled knuckles. They were covered in liver spots I'd never seen before. A tremor ran through them, a palsied shaking I couldn't control. I let out a choked, horrified gasp. With a sense of dread, I glanced up at the rearview mirror. The face that looked back was a haggard, ancient version of myself. My hair was thin and white. My face was a road map of deep-set wrinkles, my skin sagging from my cheekbones. And my eyes. My eyes were wide with a terror that was ancient, the eyes of a man who had been trapped on this road not for an hour, but for an eternity. That was the breaking point. The sight of that withered stranger in my own mirror shattered my paralysis. This road wasn't just trapping me. It was consuming me. It was feeding on my time, on my life, aging me with every pass. I was not going to let this road erase me. I was not going to become another ghost story whispered at a truck stop. As I approached the spot where the loop seemed to reset, just past the ghostly skeletal image of the decaying church, I made a desperate, insane decision. The road wanted me to follow it. It demanded it. It had laid out a path, and my only role was to trace it until I faded into nothing. So I wouldn't. With a guttural roar that was part anger and part terror, I cranked the steering wheel hard to the right. I wasn't aiming for the curve. I was aiming my 80,000-pound rig directly into the dark, dense forest that bordered the road. "To hell with you!" I screamed, my voice raw, screaming at the road, at the night, at whatever malevolent, time-eating force had trapped me. The truck lurched violently off the asphalt. The front wheels hit the soft earth of the shoulder with a bone-jarring thud that sent my teeth rattling in my skull. The rig crashed through a line of small trees and underbrush. The sound a deafening cacophony of snapping wood and screeching, scraping metal. Branches that looked like claws raked along the side of my cab, trying to hold me back. It was a reckless, suicidal move. 1,000 things could have gone wrong. I could have hit a massive, unseen tree and been crushed. I could have jackknifed, the trailer swinging around to obliterate the cab. I could have rolled the entire rig down the steep, unseen embankment. But I didn't. After about 50 yards of a violent, chaotic, world-shaking journey through the wilderness, the truck came to a sudden, lurching stop, its front end buried deep in a thicket of rhododendron. The tough, leathery leaves plastered against my windshield. The silence that followed was absolute. The engine had stalled. The world was utterly still. I sat there, my body shaking from a combination of adrenaline and the violent impact, my ears ringing. My chest ached and I was sure I was covered in bruises, but I was off the road. I was out of the loop. I had broken the cycle. I took a deep, shuddering breath. The air in the cab was normal again. The heavy, charged feeling was gone. I slowly, fearfully raised my hands and looked at them in the dim glow of the emergency lights. They were my hands. 55-year-old hands, calloused and worn from a lifetime of work, but they were mine. The liver spots were gone. The tremor was gone. I risked a glance in the mirror. My face was pale and covered in a cold sweat, but it was my face, my graying hair, my familiar wrinkles. I was me again. I was free. It took me the rest of the night and most of the next morning to get a tow truck to pull my rig out of the woods. The driver, a grizzled local with a chewing tobacco bulge in his cheek, just shook his head as he surveyed the damage. "Must have been one hell of a deer, old-timer," he said. I just nodded. "Yeah," I said, my voice hoarse. "One hell of a deer." It was a lie, but it was 1,000 times easier than the truth. The truth was that I had driven my truck into a forest to escape a ghost. Not a ghost of a person, but the ghost of a road, a place that had become so saturated with loneliness and repetition that it had learned how to feed. I don't drive that stretch of highway at night anymore. I'll take the long way around, add hours to my trip if I have to. My dispatcher complains, but he doesn't know what I know. I know what that road is capable of. It's a hungry road. It feeds on time, on reality, and on the sanity of anyone unlucky enough to get caught in its endless decaying embrace. I broke the cycle. I got away. But I have no doubt that the road is still there, waiting in the darkness, looking as normal and innocent as ever, waiting for the next lonely driver to pass the little whitewashed church and begin the loop all over again. My name is Maria Lopez. I'm 31 and my world smells of diesel, road dust, and the faint sweet scent of the air freshener that hangs from my rearview mirror. A little pine tree that my son Mateo picked out for me. I've been driving for a few years now, a relative newcomer in a world of grizzled veterans. I didn't get into this business for the romance of the open road or a love of machinery. I got into it to build a better life for Mateo. Every mile I drive, every load I deliver, every lonely sunrise I watch from my cab is a brick in the foundation of his future. His picture is taped to my dashboard right next to the speedometer. It's a school photo, his hair slicked down and a toothy 5-year-old grin stretching from ear to ear. That picture is my compass, my co-pilot, my constant companion on the long, lonely nights. Being a mother on the road is hard. It's a constant state of being split in two. I carry a piece of my heart with me, that little smiling photo, and another larger piece is always back home, hundreds of miles away. I live my life through FaceTime calls where I watch him lose another tooth and text messages from my sister with pictures of his latest Lego creation. Maybe that's why what I saw in the hollows of West Virginia affected me so deeply. It wasn't just a ghost story I stumbled upon, it was a mother's worst nightmare, played out in a silent, heartbreaking pantomime that spoke directly to the part of me that is forever tied to my child. I was hauling a tanker of non-hazardous industrial lubricant through the heart of what used to be booming coal country. The landscape there is a paradox, a place of such stunning, breathtaking natural beauty that it almost makes you weep, yet it's scarred by the deep, unhealed wounds of a dead industry. You drive through lush, green mountains that roll on forever, the slopes thick with trees and rhododendron. Then you'll round a bend and the beauty is violently interrupted by the skeletal remains of a town. A handful of dilapidated houses, their porches collapsing in on themselves like sighing old men. A boarded-up company store, its windows like blind eyes. And always looming on a nearby hill, the rusted skeletal frame of a coal tipple, standing like a monument to a forgotten way of life, a tombstone for a community. These places have a heavy atmosphere, a palpable sense of loss that clings to the air like the ever-present fog. You feel like an intruder, your modern roaring engine a sacrilege in a place so steeped in silence and memory. It was late afternoon, that magical, melancholy hour when the sun begins to dip below the mountain ridges. The light turns golden and syrupy, and the shadows in the hollows grow long and deep, stretching out like dark fingers. I was passing one of these ghost towns, a place my map identified as Blackwood Creek, though there was nothing left standing to suggest a name. It was just a collection of a dozen or so decaying houses, their paint peeled away by decades of harsh winters and humid summers. The road through the town had crumbled at the edges, forcing me to slow my rig to a crawl. As I navigated the broken asphalt, my eyes scanned the ruins. And that's when I saw them. On an overgrown patch of ground in front of what must have been the town's one-room schoolhouse, a slightly larger, more collapsed building than the rest, a group of children were playing. There were 5 of them, ranging in age from maybe 6 to 10. My first thought was one of pure, unadulterated shock. Who would be living out here? This place was a ruin miles from any functioning town. What family would be so desperate as to take up residence in a ghost town? And who would let their children play among the rusted metal and rotting wood? It felt irresponsible, dangerous. I let my truck roll forward at a walking pace. My curiosity piqued. Then I looked closer, and a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air washed over me, starting at the base of my spine and spreading outwards. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes. The 2 girls wore simple, faded pinafore dresses over long-sleeved blouses, the kind I'd only seen in sepia-toned photographs. The 3 boys wore patched overalls and newsboy caps. Their clothes were ragged, smudged with the dirt they were playing in. They were playing a game, some kind of tag or ring around the rosy, their movements fluid and full of a boundless, youthful energy. They chased each other in wide, joyful circles through the tall weeds, their faces alight with excitement. But it was their laughter that stopped my heart. There was none. They were playing in absolute, profound silence. Their mouths were open in what should have been peals of laughter and joyous, breathless shouts, but not a single sound reached my ears. The world outside my cab was a silent movie. I could see a boy with a cap on backwards, his mouth wide open in a silent yell as he chased a girl with pigtails. I could see her looking over her shoulder, her face a perfect picture of laughing, feigned terror. But the only sound was the low rumble of my engine and the crunch of gravel under my tires. It was the most unsettling thing I had ever witnessed. The perfect visual representation of joy, completely divorced from the sound it should make. It was a memory projected onto the fading light. I brought my truck to a slow, creeping crawl, my trucker's instincts screaming at me to keep moving, to get away from this wrongness. But the mother in me, the part of me that saw my own son's playful energy in their silent movements, was captivated and horrified. I couldn't look away. The children seemed utterly oblivious to my massive, noisy truck, a 40-ton metal beast that had intruded upon their world. They continued their silent game, their faces alight with a joy that made no sound, their bare feet kicking up dust that swirled in the golden shafts of late afternoon sun. As I drew almost parallel to them, the smallest of the group, a little girl with long dark braids and a tattered faded blue dress, caught her foot on an exposed root and stumbled. She went down hard, a small, silent explosion of dust and flailing limbs. The other children immediately stopped their game. The chase was forgotten. They rushed to her side, their faces, which seconds before had been alight with mirth, now etched with identical masks of concern. The little girl sat up, clutching her knee. I could see she was crying. Her small body shook with sobs, her face contorted in the universal expression of childhood pain and distress. Tears tracked clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. But like the laughter, her crying was utterly silent. It was a pantomime of grief, a silent scream of pain that was somehow more piercing than any sound could have been. It was the most heartbreaking thing I had ever seen. Without thinking, my maternal instincts overriding everything else, I reached up and tapped my horn. Not a full blast, but a gentle, quick puff of air. The kind you do to get someone's attention without startling them. A soft meep-meep in the vast, quiet hollow. The sound, soft as it was, shattered the silent scene like a rock through a pane of glass. All 5 children froze. Their heads turned in perfect eerie unison towards my truck. The playful light in their eyes, the concern for their friend, it was all gone. It was replaced by a look of deep, soul-crushing sadness. Their faces, which had seemed rosy and full of life just moments before, were now pale and translucent in the twilight, their features indistinct, as if they were watercolor paintings left out in the rain. Their eyes were huge and dark, and they held a sorrow so ancient and profound it felt like a physical weight in the cab. They weren't just sad, they were lost, utterly and completely lost. They stared at me. Not with fear or anger, but with a kind of quiet, desperate longing. It was as if they were seeing me, really seeing me for the first time. And in my face, in my presence, they were looking for something they had lost long ago. A mother, a home, a voice to answer their silent cries. The little girl on the ground stopped her silent sobbing and just stared, her tear-streaked face a mask of desperate hope. I stared back, my hand frozen on the steering wheel, my breath caught in my throat. My own eyes filled with tears, blurring the impossible scene before me. In that moment, I wasn't a trucker on a schedule. I was just a mother looking at a group of lost children. I thought of Mateo, of his loud, infectious laughter that filled our tiny apartment, of the scraped knees I had kissed better, of the comfort I could offer with a simple hug. These children had no one. They were echoes, trapped in a silent loop of a long-lost summer afternoon, forever playing, forever falling, forever crying, with no one to hear them. As I watched, paralyzed by a grief that felt both ancient and immediate, their forms began to waver. They started to lose their substance, becoming transparent like smoke in the evening air. Their edges blurred into the deepening shadows of the ruined town. The 4 standing children faded first, their longing eyes fixed on me until they were nothing more than shimmering heat haze. And then they were gone. The little girl in the tattered blue dress was the last to fade. She remained for a moment longer, her small form still sitting on the ground, her hand still clutching her knee. She looked directly at me, and her silent, crying face was the last thing I saw before she, too, dissolved completely, leaving nothing behind but an overgrown patch of weeds, a gnarled tree root, and the crumbling foundation of an old schoolhouse. The world rushed back in. The rumble of my Engine seemed deafening now. The air in my cab felt thin and cold. I sat there for a full minute, maybe longer, tears streaming down my face. The image of their sad, pale faces burned into my memory. I finally found the strength to put the truck in gear and drive away, my heart aching with a sorrow that wasn't my own, a profound grief for a tragedy I had only just witnessed. When I got to a truck stop later that night, I couldn't rest. I couldn't eat. The image of the silent children was relentless. I sat in my cab, the comforting glow of the truck stop lights feeling a world away, and I opened my laptop. With trembling fingers, I searched for Blackwood Creek, West Virginia. It took some digging, past the ghost hunter forums and the urban exploration blogs. I finally found what I was looking for in a digitized county historical archive. A scanned newspaper article from the Logan Banner, dated February 1952. The headline was stark: "Diphtheria claims 7 in Blackwood Creek." The article told the story. In the winter of 1952, a terrible outbreak of the strangling angel, as they called it, had swept through the isolated mining camp of Blackwood Creek. A brutal blizzard had snowed the hollow in, making the roads impassable for weeks. With no access to doctors or the antitoxin that could have saved them, the disease was devastating. It moved through the small, tight-knit community with terrifying speed, claiming the lives of 7 children in the span of 2 weeks. The town, the article said, never recovered from the loss. The heart had been ripped out of it. The mine closed a few years later, and the families, with nothing left to hold them there but ghosts, just drifted away, leaving the houses and the schoolhouse to the mercy of the mountains. At the bottom of the article was a small black-bordered box. It listed the names of the children who had died: Caleb Miller, 10, Samuel Jones, 9, Elijah Peters, 8, Sarah Beth Peters, 7, Lily Ann Walker, 6. My eyes scanned the list. 5 names, 5 children. The ages matched what I had seen. My breath hitched. Lily Ann, the little girl in the blue dress. I read the names one by one, my voice a hoarse whisper in the quiet of my cab. They weren't just ghost children anymore. They had names. They were real. They were loved and mourned. They were trapped. I still drive through coal country. My job demands it. But I carry that memory with me. I think of those children forever playing their silent game, their laughter and tears lost to time. And on my dashboard, right next to the picture of my smiling, vibrant, noisy son, I keep a small, faded printout of that newspaper article. It's a reminder of the fragility of life, of the sorrow that soaks into the very ground of these mountains. And it's a memorial for the 5 silent children of Blackwood Creek who, for a few brief moments, reached out across 70 years of silence and shared their heartbreaking loneliness with a mother who was just passing by on the road. And I pray every time I pass through those hollows that one day they will find a peace that was denied to them in life. My name is Russell Hayes. I'm 44 and I'm a creature of habit. I drive the same routes, I stop at the same truck stops, and I sleep in the same remote pull-offs where I know I won't be bothered. I'm a big guy, 6'3", 250 pounds, and I've been driving long enough that not much on the road scares me. I've handled myself in bar fights. I've faced down guys trying to siphon my fuel, and I've never once felt like I wasn't in control of my situation. Fear to me was always about a physical threat, something you could see and fight. But one moonless night, parked in my favorite secluded spot in the heart of the Appalachians, I learned what true fear is. It's not about what you can fight, it's about what you can't. It's about the thing that doesn't have a face, the thing that doesn't make a sound, the thing that decides to get in the truck with you. This spot I'm talking about is a small, unmarked gravel pull-off on a quiet stretch of highway. It's surrounded by a dense, old-growth forest, and it's set back from the road enough that the occasional passing car is just a distant whisper. It was my sanctuary, a place of perfect peace and quiet. I had parked there for the night, gone through my usual routine, ate a cold sandwich, called my wife, and settled into my sleeper berth with a book. The darkness out there is absolute. There are no city lights, no street lights, nothing. It's a deep, primal blackness that feels ancient. I had just turned off my reading light, and I was lying there in the dark, listening to the gentle hum of the truck's auxiliary power unit and the chirping of crickets outside. It was peaceful. That's when I saw it. Through the small window of my sleeper, I saw a flicker of movement at the edge of the woods. It was hard to make out at first. I thought it might be a deer. I lay still, watching. But it wasn't an animal. It was a shadow. But it was wrong. It wasn't a shadow cast by something, it was the thing itself. It was a tall, impossibly thin shape that seemed to detach itself from the deeper darkness of the tree line. It was darker than the night, a moving void in the shape of a man, but stretched, elongated like a figure in a distorted mirror. It stood there for a long moment, perfectly still. I felt a cold prickle of unease. My mind, ever the rationalist, tried to find an explanation. A trick of the moonlight filtering through the clouds. My eyes playing tricks on me in the low light. But there was no moon. Then it began to move. It didn't walk. It glided. It flowed over the gravel of the pull-off with a smooth, silent, unnatural motion, making no sound. It moved directly towards my truck. The crickets, which had been a constant chorus, fell silent. The world outside my cab went dead quiet. All I could hear was the frantic, sudden hammering of my own heart. I was frozen. My body was paralyzed by a fear so pure and so absolute that it bypassed all my fight or flight instincts and went straight to freeze. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could only watch as this thing approached. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and its limbs were long and thin, ending in what looked like tapering points instead of hands or feet. It had no discernible features, no face, no clothes. It was just a hole in the shape of a man cut out of the fabric of the night. It reached the passenger side of my cab and stopped. I was expecting it to peer in the window, to rattle the door, but it did something far more terrifying. It reached out one of its long, thin arms, and the pointed end of it touched the door handle. I heard a soft, metallic click, the sound of the passenger door unlatching. My blood turned to ice water. The door was locked. I had locked it myself out of habit an hour ago, but I had heard it clear as day, the unmistakable sound of the lock disengaging. Slowly, silently, the passenger door swung open. The dome light in the cab should have come on, but it didn't. The darkness inside remained absolute. A deeper patch of night, the shape of the open door, appeared in my peripheral vision. And then, the shadow began to climb in. It folded its impossibly long limbs into the cab, a slow, deliberate, and utterly silent process. It was like watching a spider crawl into a matchbox. It unfolded itself into the passenger seat, its head nearly touching the roof of the cab. It was in the truck with me. Not 3 feet away. I lay on my bunk, rigid with terror, my eyes screwed shut now, too afraid to look. I could feel it. I could feel its presence. It was a palpable cold, a void that seemed to suck all the warmth and life out of the air. The cab, my sanctuary, my home on the road, had been invaded and was now a tomb. I could smell something, a faint, dry, dusty odor, like an ancient book being opened, or a grave that had been sealed for centuries. It just sat there. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just occupied the space, its silent, featureless presence a weight on my very soul. The silence was the most terrifying part. It was a silence that was alive, a crushing, expectant void. I lay there, every muscle in my body screaming, waiting for something to happen. Waiting for a touch, a sound, a final terrifying action. But nothing came. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed in the dark with that thing sitting in my passenger seat. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Time had ceased to have any meaning. My entire universe had shrunk to the space of that cab, to the presence of the silent, dark passenger. I was no longer a man in a truck. I was a consciousness trapped in a box with an unknowable horror. Eventually, the first faint gray light of dawn began to filter through the windows. The coming of the light was a slow, agonizing process. As the darkness in the cab began to soften, to turn from absolute black to a murky gray, I felt a change. The oppressive cold began to recede. The feeling of a heavy, watchful presence began to lessen. With a courage I didn't know I possessed, I slowly opened my eyes. I turned my head just a fraction of an inch and looked towards the passenger seat. It was empty. The passenger door was closed and locked. The cab was empty. There was no trace that anything had been there. The sun was rising, birds were beginning to sing, and the world was returning to normal. But I was not. I was broken. I started the truck and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I was 100 miles away, parked in the bright, noisy, crowded lot of a massive travel center, surrounded by the comforting sights and sounds of other people, other trucks. I never slept in that pull-off again. I don't sleep in any isolated spots anymore. I stick to the brightly lit, noisy truck stops where the darkness is kept at bay. I know what's in the dark. I know what waits in the deep woods and the silent places. It doesn't have to break a window. It doesn't have to force a lock. It just decides to come in. And the most terrifying thing in the world is not the monster that screams and claws at your door. It's the one that opens it, climbs in, and just sits with you in the silence, waiting for the morning to come. I apologize for the oversight in the previous response. It appears I only provided stories 7, 8, and 9 and omitted a 10th story. The original outline concluded with the 9th story, The Shadow That Climbed Into His Cab, as the finale. However, as a horror scriptwriter, I know that sometimes the most terrifying tales are the ones that are unexpected. Let's consider this a bonus feature, a hidden track at the end of the album. I will now write a 10th story, one that wasn't on the original list, to complete your request. This one delves into the unsettling nature of sound and the lonely highways of the Appalachian night. My name is Thomas Callahan. I'm 62 and I'm on my last leg, not in life, I hope, but in my career. After 40 years behind the wheel, I'm getting ready to park the rig for good, trade the diesel fumes for the salt air of the coast where my wife and I bought a small house. I'm a man who has seen it all, heard it all, and I've become comfortably numb to the strangeness of the road. I've always said that the loneliest sound in the world isn't silence. It's the sound of a radio scanning for a signal in the dead of night, a desperate search for a human voice in the static. I never imagined that one night in the winding hills of West Virginia, I'd find a station that wasn't looking for me but was waiting for me. I was on a milk run, a route I could drive in my sleep, hauling mining supplies up US Route 119. It's a road that cuts right through the heart of coal country, a lonely stretch of asphalt that's often shrouded in fog and an almost tangible melancholy. It was late, well past midnight, and the road was mine. I was in that comfortable semi-trance state that long-haul drivers know well, my mind quiet, my body on autopilot. To break the monotony, I had my old CB radio on, but the channels were dead. My satellite radio subscription had lapsed, a bill I'd forgotten to pay in the chaos of packing for retirement, so I was left with the old AM/FM dial. I hit the scan button and the radio began its familiar rhythmic search. It swept past static, a snippet of a gospel hymn. More static, a flash of a political talk show, and then it stopped. It locked onto a signal with crystal clarity, which was unusual for this part of the mountains. There was no station identification, no DJ, just a voice. It was a man's voice, smooth and deep, with a calm, almost hypnotic cadence. He was reading names. Elias Vance, Sarah Mae Johnston, William Billy Crossed. He would read a name, pause for a few seconds, and then read the next. There was no music, no sound effects, just the voice and the list. I listened for a few minutes, intrigued. I figured it was some kind of memorial program, maybe from a local church reading the names of the deceased. The names had an old-timey feel to them, the kind you see on weathered tombstones. I kept driving, the voice a steady, somber companion in my cab. The list went on and on. After about 10 minutes, the voice paused. I expected a commercial or a station ID, but instead a different sound came through the speakers. It was the unmistakable sound of a telephone, an old rotary phone, being dialed. The slow, deliberate whir, click, click, click of the dial turning and returning. It dialed a full 7 numbers, then the sound of the line ringing. Once, twice. A new voice answered, a woman's voice, tinny and distant, as if speaking from the other end of a long, hollow tube. "Hello?" she said, her voice trembling with a nervous energy. "Is this the residence of Elias Vance?" the smooth-voiced announcer asked. "Yes," the woman replied, her voice tight. He was my husband. He passed 10 years ago. Who is this?" "We have a message for him," the announcer said, his tone unchanging. "A message? From who?" "From beyond," the announcer stated, as simply as if he were giving the weather. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, then a choked sob, followed by the loud, jarring clatter of the receiver being dropped, and then the steady, monotonous tone of a disconnected line. The announcer paused for a beat, and then, without a word of commentary, he began reading names again. Jacob Miller, Rebecca Finch, Samuel P. Jones. My blood had turned to ice. This wasn't a memorial show, it was a radio broadcast that was calling the families of the dead and telling them they had a message from the other side. It was the cruelest, most bizarre thing I had ever heard. What kind of sick individual would run a station like this? I felt a surge of anger. I fumbled for the scan button, wanting to get this vile broadcast out of my cab. But my hand stopped short. I was horrified, but I was also utterly captivated. I listened as the scene repeated itself. The announcer read a list of names for 10 minutes. He dialed a number. A confused, often elderly person would answer. He would ask for someone who was long dead. He would offer a message from beyond. The reaction was always the same: fear, grief, a dropped phone. With each call, I felt a deeper sense of dread. The broadcast was so clear, so professional in its strange, macabre way. The announcer's voice was so calm, so devoid of any emotion. He was a psychopathic Virgil, guiding listeners through a bizarre, electronic underworld. I tried to place his accent, but it was unnervingly neutral. A standard mid-century broadcaster's voice that seemed to come from no particular place and every place at once. As I drove on, a terrifying thought began to form in my mind. The names. They were all local sounding. Vance, Johnston, Miller. These were the names of the mountains. What if this wasn't a prank being broadcast from 100 miles away? What if this was local? What if it was real? The announcer finished another list of names and began to dial again. Whir, click, click, whir, click, click, click. I found myself counting the turns, my heart pounding in time with the clicks. The line began to ring. A man answered, his voice gruff. "Yeah? Is this the residence of Thomas Callahan?" the announcer asked. The world stopped. The road, the truck, the night, it all dissolved. The only thing that existed was that voice coming from my radio saying my name. It wasn't a common name, not around here. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. It was a coincidence. It had to be. Some other Thomas Callahan. "He ain't here," the gruff voice on the radio answered. It was a voice I knew. It was my neighbor Bill, who was watching my house while I was on the road. "We have a message for him," the announcer said. "A message? From who?" Bill asked, his voice suspicious. "From his father," the announcer replied. My father. My father, who died 20 years ago. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over me. I felt like I was going to be sick. I wanted to turn the radio off, to smash it with my fist, but I was paralyzed. "His father's dead," Bill said flatly. "We know," the announcer's smooth voice replied. "The message is, don't sell the old house. The well is not what you think it is." I slammed on the brakes. The rig screeched to a halt in the middle of the empty highway, the tires smoking. The old house, my father's house, the one I grew up in 100 miles from here. I had just put it on the market last week. And the well, the old stone-lined well in the backyard that had run dry 50 years ago. My father had always been strange about that well. He'd filled it with concrete himself back in the 60s, telling me it was unstable, but he'd had a look in his eyes I'd never forgotten. A look of fear. On the radio, I heard Bill let out a string of curses. "Who is this? What kind of sick joke is this?" he yelled, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of the line going dead. The announcer paused, and then he broke format. He didn't read any more names. He spoke directly to me. "We'll be right back with more messages for the road after this," he said, his voice as smooth as ever. And then a new sound filled my cab. It was a song, an old country song from the 1940s, a mournful ballad about a lost love. But it was my mother's favorite song, the one she used to sing to me as a boy. I sat there in my idling truck, in the middle of a dark West Virginia highway, shaking uncontrollably, listening to my dead mother's favorite song being broadcast by a phantom radio station that knew my name, knew my plans, and was delivering messages from my dead father. The rational part of my brain was screaming. It was a hack, a sophisticated prank. Someone had cloned my phone, knew my personal details. But how could they know about the well? I had never told anyone about my father's strange behavior. It was a secret buried for half a century. The song ended. The announcer's voice returned. "And now a final message for the night," he said. "For Thomas Callahan. We know you're listening. We know you're on your last run. We just wanted to say we'll be waiting for you on the other side." Then a final sound. The sound of a radio dial being turned, and the crystal-clear signal dissolved into a sea of hissing, crackling static. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I threw the truck in gear and I drove. I drove through the rest of the night fueled by pure terror, the static from the radio a mocking hiss in the background. I didn't turn it off. I was too afraid to touch it. The next morning, the first call I made was to the real estate agent. I took the old house off the market. I don't know what's in that well, and I don't want to know. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. I finished my run. I parked my rig for the last time. I'm retired now. I'm sitting on my porch looking at the ocean, but I'm not at peace. The road gave me one last story to tell, a final chilling mystery. I don't turn on the radio much anymore. I prefer the silence. But sometimes late at night when the wind is just right, I think I can hear it. A faint distant voice carried on the static reading, a list of names waiting for the next lonely driver on a dark highway. Waiting to make one last call. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, let me know in the comments. Which one chilled you the most? Don't forget to like, share with your friends, and subscribe to Horror Whispers for more terrifying tales.